समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
People need to control their own destinies with their friends, said Yossi Abu, who's CEO of the Israeli company New Med Energy. He was being asked about the weaponization of Hormuz, onto which an outsized share of global economic stability currently hangs. Evocative, no? How geopolitics and geoeconomics collide, more so during polycrises. While no one can picture what exactly is to come and when, one can make a reasonable argument about how the strategic contours will appear and what they will address. So, amidst all uncertainty, the GCC will certainly spend the next few years exploring everything that can free them from their current strategic enslavement to the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow choke point and its weaponization, whether through direct disruption, threats of mining, toll booth fees, or simply the uncertainty it perpetuates into markets, has sent shockwaves across global supply chains. Prices continue to remain spiked not because of shortages but because of fear and supply disruptions. Alongside come other costs, for instance, rising insurance premiums, the thinning strategic reserves for countries, and very soon, perhaps even reduced demand. Therefore, crises of this magnitude often do more than merely disrupt. They force a strategic reset. Let's understand what this reset is going to look like. Present events are triggering a familiar rethink, a shift not just in routes, but in the very architecture of connectivity between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Now, and in that sense, the current turmoil may have revived a project many had already written off. And here I mean the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, or the IMEC. But the catch is, the revival won't be in its original form. IMEC 1.0 had certain limits that constrained its operationalization. When IMEC was first announced with much fanfare at the G20 summit in New Delhi on 9 September 2023, it was framed as a timely, integrative, and inclusive vision. Backed by the G7 and supported by key Gulf countries, it promised to connect India to Europe via the Middle East, linking ports on the west coast of India to the UAE, then to overland routes through Saudi Arabia, onward to Israel's Haifa port, and then to Europe, entering the continent via Piraeus in Greece. Now, the logic was reasonable. It aimed to create alternative trade routes, reduce dependency on traditional choke points like the Suez Canal, and build economic and infrastructural interdependence among like-minded partners. It also drew on the broader political momentum generated by the 2020 Abraham Accords, which sought to normalize relations between Israel and several Arab states, beginning then with the UAE. Now, for New Delhi, this aligned well with its strategy of multi-alignment in the Middle East, deepening ties simultaneously with the Gulf, Israel, and Iran. Even though India's tilt towards the Gulf, mainly the UAE and Israel, is pretty much key to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Middle East engagement. And this is a point I have underscored again and again. But IMEC, as originally conceived, was always more of a vision than reality. Now, operationally, it was a logistics nightmare. It looked like a patchwork of maritime and overland routes requiring multiple transitions and navigating different regulatory frameworks. The reliance on Haifa as a final node before entering the Mediterranean Sea brought additional vulnerabilities, particularly given the persistent threat of proxy conflicts in the region. Now, industry experts opined that de-risking finance for such a corridor in one of the world's most volatile regions would pose challenges for private capital. Then came the shocker everyone dreaded: the 7th October 2023 Hamas attack that led to a prolonged spiral of Israel's war against the network of proxies, the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the first 12-day war, and now the second broader war directly with Iran. In conferences across the world, diplomats, scholars, and stakeholders have brainstormed on how to salvage this wonderful idea from its operational limits and the attritional external wars. And what has become clearer is that IMEC 1.0 belonged to a geopolitical context that no longer exists. But first, let's get back to the Hormuz shock and imperative of resilience required for ensuring energy security in the future. The current Iran war has laid bare a fundamental reality. 20% of global energy trade cannot afford to rely on a single artery, no matter how resilient and cost effective. Today, Hormuz is the strategic vulnerability and undoing for the rich Gulf countries and their customers across the world, especially in Asia and Europe. As energy analyst Javier Blas has consistently highlighted, recent price volatility reflects not a structural shortage, I mentioned that earlier as well, but a supply shock amplified by uncertainty and supply disruption. Oil has borne much of that brunt. Gas, which is natural gas for now, remains relatively stable, but that equilibrium remains fragile as well. Now, all the above taken together add a certain depth to the real takeaway, which is that future lies not in replacing one route with another, but in creating multiple parallel nodes supporting each other. And that brings me to what I call the IMEC 2.0. And this IMEC 2.0 is not going to look like a straight line, but more like a resilient lattice of supply routes. So today, as I just mentioned, IMEC has reacquired the space to evolve. But the point to remember is that the original vision of a single linear corridor is no longer sufficient or worth investing in. What is emerging instead is the need for a network of interconnected routes, pipelines, ports, and logistical hubs, what in short can be called an IMEC 2.0, where resilience would be built through redundancy. Rather than a fixed pathway from India to Europe via the Middle East, we are likely to see a lattice of options. Maritime routes complemented by overland pipelines, northern corridors intersecting with southern ones, and multiple entry and exit points across regions. Now, in defense of this line versus lattice model I just proposed, I can explain how this shift is already visible. The response from regional GCC players to weaponization of Hormuz has been swift, even though uneven, and three pipelines have usually hogged the limelight. Saudi Arabia has fallen back on its east-west pipeline, also called the Petro Line, to bypass Hormuz, transporting oil to the Red Sea. The UAE has relied on the Fujairah port pipeline to maintain exports. Iraq is increasingly looking northward, reviving routes from Kirkuk through Ceyhan in Turkey. There are also reports of vessels avoiding the Iranian channels in the Strait of Hormuz by hugging close to the Omani coastline. Now, beyond the above three, there is much more action underway. For instance, Jordan and Syria, once considered too unstable for large-scale infrastructure, are re-emerging as potential transit hubs. Emirati investments in the port of Aqaba in Jordan and the redevelopment of Latakia in Syria speak of a new strategic intent. The Basra-Aqaba pipeline, capable of transporting up to 1.5 million barrels a day, has gained renewed urgency, offering Iraq a viable alternative to Gulf routes and also an alternative to dependency on Kirkuk-Ceyhan with Turkey that have political sticking points over Kurds. Syria, despite its internal fragmentation, is smartly positioning itself as a transit economy. Agreements to expand Latakia's capacity and al-Sharah's repeated utterances to integrate Syria with regional pipelines show he is working on leveraging Syria's geographical strengths. Even more unmissable, in my opinion, is Iraq's recent move to resume overland exports through Syria, sending crude to the Mediterranean via the Banias. These changes I just told you about aren't merely tactical solutions, but these are blocks in building a larger resilience grid that the GCC will now pursue as a strategic necessity. And let me also now delve a bit on the question of Israel, because so far I haven't mentioned it. Amid this reconfiguration, an interesting point emerges. While political normalization between Israel and key Gulf states remains incomplete, Israel today sits on one of the most strategically relevant infrastructures in the region, and this is the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline. Built decades ago, this pipeline connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, effectively creating a land bridge between Asian and European energy markets. With a capacity exceeding 1 million barrels a day and significant storage capabilities as well, it offers a ready-to-use alternative to maritime choke points. Now, the logic is compelling to say the least. Oil transported via Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline to the Red Sea could be moved to Eilat, pumped through Israel and shipped onward to Europe. Now, under usual circumstances, one would argue, such a configuration would be politically fraught, even if not impossible, because not everything is hunky-dory between Israel and the GCC, at least other than the UAE. The scale of disruption in Hormuz is forcing a reconsideration of previously unviable alignments. While full normalization may remain elusive, functional cooperation driven by economic necessity becomes harder to dismiss as days go by. Perhaps the region could be inching to something like an Abraham Accords 2.0. Additionally, if IMEC 2.0 is to take shape, Europe's ports and routes will also demand a rethink, because ultimately it is about connecting Asia to Europe. Let me now touch upon that vertical briefly. Ports such as Trieste in Italy and Thessaloniki in Greece are likely to gain more prominence as entry points into the European market than the China-dominated Piraeus. These hubs, already integrated into Europe's continental logistics networks, can serve as anchors for diversified trade flows coming from the Gulf via the Mediterranean Sea. Now, there is certainly much more to the European leg of IMEC, but that's another story for another day. Let me for now come back to where it gets relevant for us. And here, I'd like to underscore the connection between the Indo-Pacific region and the Indo-Mediterranean. As one of the world's largest energy importers, India has repeatedly proven to be acutely exposed to disruptions in the Gulf. While the Indo-Pacific remains a key strategic domain of India's foreign policy endeavors, India's broader strategic posture and stakes in the Indo-Mediterranean have significantly evolved. Investments in Israel, deepening ties with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and growing partnerships with Greece, Cyprus, and Italy all point to India's expanding Indo-Med footprint. India must leverage its multi-alignment and position itself as a stakeholder in the broader development of networks. This means engaging with multiple partners across the GCC, and not just the GCC, but also across Levant, supporting infrastructure development across regions and leveraging its diplomatic capital to bridge competing interests and also trust deficit between Israel and other GCC countries. It will also mean navigating a more contested strategic space. The Indo-Mediterranean today is set to become a theatre of competition, economic, political, and perhaps even military, maybe even before the Indo-Pacific turns to hot war. I'll be back to discuss India's strategic positioning and engagement with the new strategic construct, the Indo-Med, which is closely tied today with our national interest. Stay tuned.